Hi everyone, this is Mrs. J, and I'm doing a read aloud of the Odyssey as retold by Gillian Cross. We're on Chapter 5, Ghosts and Monsters, on page 74. Odysseus spent most of the night listening to Circe's instructions. At dawn the next morning, he woke his men and ordered them to get ready for the voyage. Hastily, they left Circe's house and headed down to the shore to prepare their ship, all except Elpenor. He had drunk too much wine the night before. Then, because he was hot, he'd climbed onto the roof of Circe's palace and fallen asleep there. When he heard Odysseus calling the sailors together, he woke up suddenly. Forgetting where he was, he jumped to his feet and fell off of the roof. His neck broke and he died instantly. None of the others noticed what had happened. They were all listening in amazement to what Odysseus was saying. "We cannot sail yet for Ithaca," he told them. "First, we have to go to the land of the dead and ask advice from the prophet Tiresias." The sailors were afraid, but they obeyed his orders. As they pushed their ship out into the water, Circe came down to the shore with a ram and a black ewe. "Remember," she said to Odysseus, "you must sail until you find a grove of poplars and long-leaved willow trees. When you see that, you must walk inland and sacrifice these animals where the two rivers meet, as I told you." She drove the sheep on board and then lifted her staff and waved it in the air, calling up the north wind that they needed. All day they sailed across the wine-dark sea. As night fell, they reached the wild coast and saw a single grove of poplars and willows, exactly as Circe had foretold. Pulling their ship onto the beach, they walked inland, driving the sheep ahead of them. Soon they saw a steep, rocky pinnacle looming in the darkness. That marked the place where the river of flaming fire joined the river of lamentation. Together they flowed into the great black Archon that ran through the land of the dead. "This is where we must sacrifice the sheep," Odysseus said. "When they smell blood, the souls of the dead will rise up to meet us, and we will ask them to bring Tiresias." Following Circe's instructions, he poured the honey and milk into a trench, adding wine and water and grains of barley. Then he sacrificed the sheep and drew his sword. The souls of the dead came fluttering up from the underworld and howled eerie cries. Thousands of them flocked around Odysseus as he stood shivering on the edge of the trench. The ghosts of young men and girls floated next to battle-scarred warriors. Old men with gray hair brushed against newly married brides. They jostled together, vying for Odysseus's attention. He scanned their insubstantial faces, and then suddenly he recognized one. "Elpenor, how can you be here among the dead?" "I fell from the roof and broke my neck," Elpenor said mournfully. "My body is lying behind Circe's palace. Please go back and give me a proper funeral." "I will," promised Odysseus. "But first, I must speak to the prophet Tiresias." "There he is," Elpenor said, "coming toward us now." Odysseus turned and saw the shade of an old blind prophet rising through the darkness. He stepped forward respectfully, waiting for Tiresias to speak. "Noble Odysseus," said Tiresias, "I know your heart's desire is to return to Ithaca, but you have angered Poseidon because you blinded the Cyclops, his son. He will make your journey as difficult as he can." "Are you saying we shall never reach home?" Odysseus cried. "There's a chance for you all," Tiresias said, "but only if you keep your men under control. When you reach the island of Thrinacia, don't let your men touch the sun god's cattle. If they hurt those cattle, your ship will be lost, and all of your sailors too." "What about me?" said Odysseus. "You may survive, but if you do, I prophesy that it will be many years before you reach Ithaca, and when you do, you will enter your house in rags and find it full of trouble." "Will Poseidon be satisfied with that?" Odysseus asked. Tiresias shook his great head sadly. "If you want to be free of Poseidon's curse, you must make another journey. Travel inland with an oar over your shoulder until you are far away from the sea. When someone mistakes your oar for a winnowing fan, sacrifice to Poseidon there. Then he will let you live in peace again." Bowing his head, Tiresias drifted back into the underworld. Then all the other shades swirled around Odysseus in a cloud of familiar and unfamiliar faces, chanting their stories to him. But the spirits of the dead cannot stay long in the world of the living. One by one they dwindled away, until Odysseus and his men were on their own beside the thundering rivers. With heavy hearts they returned to their ship and let the wind carry them back to Circe's island. There, at dawn, they built a funeral pyre for their friend Elpenor and cremated him, with all of his weapons. When his ashes were cold, they built a mound on the seashore so that his name would never be forgotten. After the funeral, Circe and her handmaids came down to the shore, carrying bread and meat and sparkling red wine. "You are heroes," Circe said. "You have all been to the land of the dead and back again. Spend the rest of the day here feasting with me, and I will tell you about the dangers ahead so that you are ready to face them away when you sail away tomorrow." All day they feasted until sunset. As night began to fall, the sailors settled down to sleep beside the ship. Then Circe took Odysseus by the hand and led him to a place where they could talk privately. "You're going to sail into many dangers," she said. "First, you will come to the sirens, whose songs drive men mad with their longing. If you succeed in passing them, you will reach the wandering rocks. They wreck every ship that approaches. You must avoid them, but you can only do that by facing a terrible choice. Listen carefully to everything I tell you, Odysseus." Far into the night they sat together, and Circe talked on and on, warning Odysseus about what lay ahead. In the morning, Odysseus woke his men and ordered them onto the ship. Circe gave them a favorable wind, and they set sail immediately. When they were safely out at sea, Odysseus told them of Circe's warnings. "A great danger lies ahead of us," he said. "Soon we shall come to the place where the sirens sing. Everyone who hears them wants to go on listening forever. Unless you close your ears to the sound, you will never reach home, never see your wives and children again." He lifted a ball of beeswax that Circe had given him, working it in his fingers as he spoke. "I shall block your ears with this to protect you, but not my own. I am determined to hear the sirens sing, and Circe told me the only way to do that safely. When I have filled your ears with wax, you must tie me to the mast. Knot the ropes tightly so that I cannot move, and if I beg you to let me go, just pull even tighter." As he spoke, the wind dropped and the ship came to a standstill. The sailors looked at one another. They would never get past the sirens unless they kept rowing. Odysseus went around the ship, plugging their ears with wax. When he had finished, the sailors fetched ropes and lashed him to the mast so tight that he couldn't move his hand or foot. Then they took up their oars and began to row as hard as they could. Very soon they drew upon a flowery meadow that ran beside the seashore. That was where the sirens sat, surrounded by the skeletons of all who had stayed to listen to their song. As soon as they saw Odysseus' ship, they began to sing again, turning their heads so that the sound floated out over the water. "Come here to us and stop your restless journey," they sang. "Come here and listen to the sound of wisdom, to all gathered knowledge of the world, distilled into the music of our song. Come here to us, come here to us, come here to us." That was the song Odysseus heard. It filled him with such longing that he shouted to his men to pull their oars and untie him. When they did not answer, because they couldn't hear, he screamed and ranted, rolling his eyes and making anguished faces. "Undo the ropes," he shrieked. "Everything I said before was nonsense. Everything is nonsense, except the siren's song. Stop rowing and let me go to them." If he'd been free, Odysseus would have jumped overboard and swum to the shore, but he couldn't move, and the sailors obeyed the instructions he had given them. Two men jumped up and tightened the cords that held him to the mast. The others kept rowing, pulling with all their strength. Some of them were tempted to stop and unblock their ears. They had been away from home for more than 10 years now, and Ithaca seemed very far away, but they were faithful to Odysseus' orders. Closing their eyes to shut out the sight of his desperate, yearning face, they leaned into their oars and pulled and pulled and pulled. For more than 10 years, Penelope had been staring at the horizon, watching for Odysseus' ships. How long should a loyal wife wait? Suppose he never comes back? Now people were asking the question openly. All over Ithaca and beyond, men talked about beautiful, wise Penelope and wondered who would be her second husband. The only person who never wondered was Penelope herself. "I am Odysseus' wife," she said, "and I am Telemachus' mother. I will not even think of marrying again until Telemachus is a man." Her determination kept the suitors away for the time being, but there was still no sign of the 12 long ships that had sailed to Troy, and Telemachus kept on growing. Out on the wine-dark sea, the one remaining ship sailed on, away from the land of the sirens. As soon as their song faded away in the distance, Odysseus stopped shouting and struggling. When the sailors saw that, they jumped up and ran to untie him, pulling the wax out of their ears. "Thank you for your loyalty," Odysseus said. "You are faithful friends. Now, I must tell you." But before he could finish, a great cloud of spray erupted ahead of him, shooting into the sky. There was a thunderous crash of water breaking against the rocks. The sailors gasped in terror, and Odysseus stared at the spray, with Circe's next warning echoing in his head. If you succeed in passing the sirens, you will reach the land of wandering rocks. They wreck every ship that approaches. You must avoid them, but you can only do that by facing a terrible choice. They had to avoid violent crashing water, but the other route was a narrow strait between two rocky peaks. How could he tell his sailors about the dangers lurking at each one? They had just saved his life by their faithfulness. Now, according to Circe, all he had to offer them was the choice of death or death, Scylla or Charybdis, a monster or a whirlpool. Scylla's lair was a cave high up on a taller rock. Every time a ship went past, her 6 long necks swooped down. Each of her 6 hungry heads snatched up one of the sailors and ate him. The ships that tried to avoid her steered close to the other rock and fell into the great whirlpool called Charybdis. That meant certain death. 3 times a day, the whirlpool's greedy mouth opened up, sucking in everything around it. 3 times a day, it changed direction, spewing everything up again. The force was enough to smash any ship and destroy its crew. Steer close to Scylla's rock, Circe had said, and row as fast as you can. Even so, you're bound to lose 6 men. But that's better than having your whole crew swallowed up by Charybdis. There was no other way. Odysseus didn't dare tell his men the whole truth, in case they were so terrified that they stopped rowing. He told them only half. We have to sail between those 2 rocky peaks, he said, pointing at the entrance to the narrow strait. But we must be very careful. Do you see that fig tree growing on the smaller rock? Below that is a gigantic whirlpool. We must stay away from that. He took his sword and stood on the prow of the ship, watching the way ahead. The sailors rowed nervously, looking toward the fig tree. As they passed it, the sea underneath began to swirl and boil. A vast hole opened up into the surface of the water, sucking in everything around it. The sailors pulled on their oars, pale with terror, staying as far away from the hole as possible. And that was when Scylla struck. Her ugly heads came shooting out of the cave, darting toward the sailors. She snatched up the 6 strongest men and hoisted them into the air. "Odysseus!" they screamed. "Save us, Odysseus!" What could he do? There was no way of reaching Scylla's cave. He had to watch his faithful companions dangling from her fangs like fish from a line. The monstrous heads reared up, snaking back toward her lair, and for a short time the sailors' screams echoed horribly over the water. And then there was silence. "Row on," said Odysseus fiercely. "Row on as fast as you can." There was nothing else to do. As they went through the strait, Scylla and Charybdis vanished in the distance, and a new island appeared on the horizon. As they came closer, they saw it was completely different from the horrors behind them. Streams of clear, fresh water gleamed golden in the evening light. Rich green grassland spread inland from the shore. Across the sea came the sound of cattle lowing contentedly as they were taken in for the night. To the grieving, exhausted sailors, the island looked like paradise. They imagined themselves rowing ashore. They could almost smell the wonderful scent of freshly roasted meat. But Odysseus remembered the words of the blind prophet Tiresias in the land of the dead. When you reach the island of Thrinacia, don't let your men touch the sun god's cattle. If they hurt those cattle, your ship will be lost, and all of your sailors too. Listening to the sound of the cattle across the water, he guessed that the island ahead was Thrinacia. "We mustn't land here," he said. "Tiresias warned me about this place, and so did Circe. It belongs to the sun god. We must find somewhere else to anchor." There was an uproar. "Are you made of iron?" Eurylochus said. "Do you think we can just go on rowing forever? Where's the harm in landing here, just for the night? All we want is a chance to step ashore and eat one meal without tossing around on the water." The other men shouted in agreement. They insisted that Odysseus change his mind, and let them spend the night on the dry island. At last, he nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but you must swear not to kill anything on this island, not one cow or a single sheep." The men swore a solemn oath, promising to stay close to the ship and eat nothing except the food Circe had given them. Trusting to that oath, Odysseus let them steer the ship into the sheltered cove. As they went ashore, they ate a silent meal, not talking or telling jokes, but remembering their dead companion snatched away by Scylla. They slept beside the ship, intending to go on board again as soon as it was light. But in the middle of the night, a fierce gale blew up, whipping the water into huge breakers. In the morning, there was no hope of setting sail. All they could do was drag the ship up into a cave and keep it safe from the storm. Sternly, Odysseus reminded them of their promise. Remember, you are not to touch any of the cows or sheep on the island. They all belong to the sun god, that great god whose eyes see everything. For the second time, the sailors swore to leave the animals alone. They meant it. They had plenty of bread and wine aboard the ship. They didn't expect to be in the island more than a few days. But then the wind changed. A whole month of south wind blew continuously, driving the sea against the shore. It was impossible to launch the ship. They had to stay where they were, and they began to run out of food. When their own food was gone, the sailors began to roam the island, trapping birds and catching fish. But however much they hunted, it was never enough to stop them from feeling hungry. And the hungrier they grew, the more they looked at the sun god's cattle. Odysseus saw them looking and knew there would be trouble if they didn't leave soon. But the wind was still blowing in the wrong direction, and only the gods could alter that. One morning he left the sailors on the shore and walked inland on his own. Finding a lonely, sheltered place, he prayed to all the gods on Olympus, asking for a change in the wind. He prayed so long and so earnestly that in the end, he fell asleep. In that hidden place, out of reach of the wind, he slept peacefully for several hours. Back on the beach, the sailors were muttering together while he slept. "We can't go on like this," Eurylochus said. "Odysseus threatens us with disaster if we touch the sun god's cattle. But what's more disastrous than starving to death? If we don't eat soon, we'll be too weak to sail away, even if the wind does change." The sailors hesitated, remembering their oath. Eurylochus argued harder to persuade them. "Let's choose the best of these cows and sacrifice them to the gods. Then we'll have plenty of meat to eat. If we get back to Ithaca afterward, we'll build a splendid temple for the sun god to repay him for his cattle." "But we won't get home," said one of the other sailors. "Not if we kill the cattle." Eurylochus shrugged. "Wouldn't you rather drown than starve to death?" That convinced the others. As soon as he finished speaking, they rounded up the best cattle and sacrificed them ceremonially. They built a fire on the beach to roast the meat. High on Mount Olympus, the gods heard the angry voice of Hyperion, the sun god. "O Father Zeus," he cried, "Odysseus' men have killed my beautiful cattle. Give me revenge. Otherwise I'll go down to the land of the dead and shine there, leaving the world dark forever." "Peace, Hyperion," said Zeus, the cloud gatherer. "Stay where you are and leave those cattle murderers to me. As soon as their ship is out to sea, I will strike it with a lightning bolt and smash it to pieces." When Odysseus woke up, he started back toward the beach. He hadn't gone very far when he smelled the scent of roasting meat. He'd guessed what had happened and ran the rest of the way. "What have you done?" he shouted. "Do you think the gods are blind?" The guilty sailors hung their heads. But the harm was done. It was too late to bring the cows back to life. All they could do was wait for the gods to punish them. They were surrounded by terrifying sights. The empty cowhides hunched themselves up and crawled onto the beach. The meat roasting on spits bellowed out over the fire, and from all sides, day and night, came a baleful lowing of ghostly cattle. For 6 days, the sailors had to live with what they had done, eating the stolen meat and waiting for their justice of the gods. On the seventh day, the south wind dropped at last. Pushing their ship into the water, they embarked as fast as they could, rowing away from that beach with all their strength. Very quickly, the island disappearing over the horizon. But they couldn't escape the anger of Zeus. When they were out into the open sea, a black cloud appeared from nowhere and settled over their ship. All around them, sunlight glinted on the water, but their ship was in darkness, shadowed by the cloud. Then, without warning, a savage wind roared up from the west. It hit the ship like a hurricane, snapping both forestays. The mast came crashing down in a tangle of sails and rigging and breaking the helmsman's skull. As he slid overboard, there was a great crack of thunder. A bolt of lightning shook the ship, and everyone was thrown into the sea. The sailors had no chance of surviving in the wild water. One by one, they were overwhelmed by the waves until their bodies floated around the ruined hull like a flock of seabirds. There would be no joyful homecoming for any of them. Their voyage was over forever. Only Odysseus managed to stay alive. As the waves tore the ship apart, he seized a leather rope and tied the mast and the keel board together. Clinging tightly to those two pieces of wood, he kept himself afloat as the hurricane drove him through the water. But he couldn't steer his makeshift raft. All night he was thrown from one wave to another, helpless as the wind blew him back towards Scylla and Charybdis. When dawn spread her rosy fingers across the sky, Odysseus was in the narrow strait again, being swept toward the two sharp rocks. The water below the fig tree was beginning to spin. Charybdis prepared to open its greedy mouth. Odysseus had no way of avoiding the whirlpool. There was only one possible chance of escape, if he was brave enough to take it. As the tiny raft reached the fig tree, he stood up and grabbed it at its nearest branch, high above his head. His hands closed around it, but without a foothold, he couldn't swing himself onto the tree. All he could do was cling on, hanging by his arms. Beneath him, the water spun faster and faster. With a horrible, greedy gurgle, it opened up a black hole that went right down into the depths of the sea. Dangling above it, Odysseus saw it swallow his raft. Then it gaped open again, waiting for him to get tired and lose his grip. Somehow he managed not to let go. Hour after hour he held on, watching the whirlpool below him, waiting for the moment when it began to spin the other way. The sun set, and as the sky grew dark, the direction of the water changed. Charybdis began to spew up everything it had swallowed. Odysseus hung on, waiting to see his raft reappear. As soon as the long timbers resurfaced, he unclenched his stiff hands and dropped into the water. For a second he was in its power, spinning wildly. Then he hauled himself onto the raft and lay flat out, slumped across the wood. Paddling furiously with both hands, he pulled himself away from the whirlpool as fast as he could, terrified that Scylla would catch sight of him. If she'd seen him, she would have snatched him up in a single mouthful. But it was almost dark, and the evening shadows hid him from her eyes. He came safely out of the perilous strait and into the open sea.